This was one of America's darkest histories. Want to know why? Because at this point in time in American society, the Southern legal system had become the #1 instrument of racial oppression, where madness and lawlessness and brutal segregation and unearthly hate were the rule of law. The years 1865 to 1866 were brutal, cold, barbaric. These years were years of prayers for all Black Americans, as Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida had all conspired and passed laws that would virtually prohibit all people of color upon their freedom from any work except as field hands. These laws were called the Black Codes, or Black Laws. And the only aim of this was slavery, even without chains.
The Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired. They are so far from any notion of fairness or freedom that even Northerners who are not egalitarians say these laws are unacceptable. And so Northern Republicans are faced with a dilemma. They don't want to have a big fight with the president, but to accept the idea that Johnson's policy is a success and accept the Black Codes, they feel means giving up the victory in the Civil War.
Former slave owners couldn't imagine the idea of bargaining on any kind of basis with former slaves. And they believed that the only way they could continue to grow cotton was to force African Americans to work. They had to find some kind of coercive mechanism.
The simple question here is, has America truly divorced its past in every way? Has American society changed for the better?
An encounter in Central Park, a white woman tells a black bird watcher that if he doesn't stop taping her after he had told her to put her dog on a leash, which was required in that part of the park, she tells him if he doesn't stop taping her, she's going to call the police and tell them that a black man is threatening her life.
Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
What did you see and hear in that tape?
I saw white privilege on full display and the full realization of white people that they can weaponize the police, that the police are their private constabulary, that if they just feel like they're maybe losing an argument, they can call the police. They're going to lead with the race issue because they know that the police will come and view the scene in a very particular way. They know. That's why when white people say, we didn't know, when they see these videos and they say, we didn't know it was this bad and we didn't know, they do know. They know that the state works for them. And they know that the state and law enforcement is embedded with the same narratives that they likely grew up with. And so she tells this black man to his face, she knows she's being videotaped, that she is going to weaponize the New York City Police Department. She's going to weaponize them against him if he doesn't stop filming her.
There is an African-American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
It's a powerful moment and moment for pause for us to think about the kind of power that we put into the hands of the average white person who believes that they are deputized to control the movements of black people. This is actually what existed after the Civil War with the creation of Black Codes, where black people could be questioned by any white person and asked to show their papers showing their employment, that some white person employed them, and that therefore they had the right to be on a public road. That's how they used to try to police us after the Civil War. After we were theoretically free from slavery, they created these state codes and city ordinances that controlled our conduct.
Imagine being born into a world where your every move is dictated by the color of your skin, where the simplest actions, such as learning to read or gathering with friends, feeling simply free as a human being should, are punishable by law. What would you do? This was the harsh reality for African Americans in the post-Civil War era. Mary Johnson, a a 25-year-old former slave, had thought she'd finally tasted freedom in 1865 when Union troops had marched into Mississippi, declaring the end of the Civil War. Born into slavery in 1865-1840 on a plantation in Yazoo County, Mary had endured the unimaginable, forced labor, separation from her family, and the constant fear of brutality. After emancipation, Mary would set out to build a new life. She would move to Natchez, a bustling town on the Mississippi River, hoping to find some work to do and start anew. In 1866, she would attempt to rent a land to farm, but her dreams were quickly dashed. The local sheriff would arrest her for vagrancy, citing a new law that required all people of color to have a white patron or employer as a prerequisite for any acquisition of such. This was no doubt slavery in return, and the slave code in a different guise now. In the first 2 years after the Civil War, white legislatures had passed black codes modeled after the earlier slave codes. The name Black Codes was given by Negro leaders and the Republican organs, according to historian John S. Reynolds. Black codes were part of a larger pattern of Democrats trying to maintain political dominance and suppress the freedmen, newly emancipated African Americans. They were particularly concerned with controlling the movement and labor of freedmen, as slavery had been replaced by a free labor system. Although freedmen had been emancipated, their lives were severely restricted by the Black Codes. The defining feature of the Black Codes was broad vagrancy law, which allowed local authorities to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. This period was the start of the convict lease system, also described as slavery by another name, by Douglas Blackman, an American writer and a Wall Street Journal reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for his 2008 book of the same title called Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. In his book, Douglas Blackman explores the forced labor of prisoners, overwhelmingly African American men, through the convict lease system used by states, local governments, white farmers, and corporations after the American Civil War until World War II in the southern United States. Blackman argues that slavery in the United States did not end with the Civil War, but instead persisted well into the 20th century. Now, back to Mary Johnson. As Mary was arrested for attempting to rent a land to work on, which she was charged vagrancy for, the struggling woman of color would, however, be fined $50, a staggering amount for a newly freed slave. When she couldn't pay, she was forced to work on a plantation, essentially recreating the very bondage she thought she had escaped. This was just one of many encounters Mary would have with the Black Codes. Throughout 1866 and 1867, Mary would face numerous challenges. She would be arrested again for attending a nighttime gathering, violating the curfew laws. Her children would be forced into apprenticeships with their former slave owners. She would be fined for trying to learn to read, for literacy was seen as a threat to white authority. This was just one of the many ways Black Codes ensnared African Americans, stripping them of their basic rights. Mary's story is a testament to the resilience of Black people during this dark period. Despite the suffocating grip of the Black laws, she would continue to fight for her rights, eventually becoming involved in the local Freedmen's Bureau, an organization established to assist former slaves. So, what exactly were these Black Codes or laws? The Black Codes, sometimes called the Black Laws, were laws which governed the conduct of African Americans, both free and freedmen. Enacted by Southern states between 1865 and 1867, these were a series of laws carefully and unkindly designed to restrict the freedom of formerly enslaved people of color. Under the guise of maintaining order and protecting people of color, these laws would effectively recreate the shackles of slavery. Here's how they operated. Number 1, labor contracts. Freed Black Americans were required to sign labor contracts, often under threat of arrest or violence, which bound them to plantations for a year or more. Number 2, vagrancy laws. Freed Black Americans who were unemployed or homeless could be arrested and forced to work on plantations or in chain gangs. Number 3, apprenticeship laws. Children were forced into labor, often with former slave owners, under the guise of apprenticeships. Number 4, land ownership restrictions. Freed Black Americans were prohibited from owning land or were limited in their ability to purchase property. Number 5, marriage and family restrictions. Freedmen's marriages and families were often not recognized, and they were subject to forced separations. Number 6, education restrictions. Freed Black Americans were often prohibited from attending school or receiving education, ensuring African Americans remained ignorant and powerless to a great extent. Number 7, voting restrictions. Freed African Americans were disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Number 8, curfews and travel restrictions. African Americans were confined to their homes after dark and needed permission or carried passes to travel. These laws and more were enforced with brutal, merciless efficiency, crushing the dreams of African Americans in general, just like it did Mary Johnson. So, going forward, how did this so-called Black Codes come about? The Black Codes had their roots in the so-called slave codes that had formerly been in effect in the southern states. The premise behind chattel slavery in America was that enslaved people were property and, as such, had few or no legal rights. In 1832, James Kent wrote that, in most of the United States, there is a distinction in respect to political privileges between free white persons and free colored persons of African blood, and in no part of the country do the latter, in point of fact, participate equally with the whites in the exercise of civil and political rights. The slave codes, in their many loosely defined forms, would be seen as effective tools against rebellions and other efforts by enslaved people to gain freedom. Enforcement of slave codes would vary across the South, but corporal punishment and other forms of physical violence were widely and harshly employed. Although Black codes existed before the Civil War, and although many northern states had them, the southern U.S. states codified such laws in everyday practice. The best known of these laws were passed by southern states in 1865 and 1866 after the Civil War in order to restrict African Americans' freedom and in order to compel them to work for either low or no wages. After the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the end of the Civil War in 1865, millions of enslaved African Americans were freed. But this did come at a cost, though, as Black slaves had fought and won the Civil War for the Union, which was in exchange for the Black emancipation as agreed, according to the word of the then president, Abraham Lincoln. However, the emancipation had turned out unreal, masking the death scourge it came with for the people of color who had trusted the very words of Abraham Lincoln. Now these freed people would face significant challenges such as extreme poverty, lack of education, and limited access to land and resources. This is because Southern white leaders who sought to maintain control and suppress the newly freed population would create the Black Codes to that effect. There would be nowhere to run or develop self for these Black people who had been made to, for once, believe that they are a free people at last. These Black Codes, or Black laws, were formed by white politicians and plantation owners in the southern states who dominated the state legislatures. These individuals aimed to restrict the rights and freedoms of African Americans and maintain their own power and privilege. The first Black Code was enacted in Mississippi in November 1865. Other southern states soon followed, with South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida enacting their own Black Codes in 1865 and 1866. This was born out of nothing short of sheer hateful conspiracy against people of color whom they had considered way less than the humans they are. You may want to see a breakdown on how things went down, and then you can tell us if it was anything short of a conspiracy. Number 1, in November 1865, the first Black Code was enacted in Mississippi, aimed at controlling the labor and movement of freed slaves. Number 2, a month later in December 1865, South Carolina would pass its own Black Code, requiring freed slaves to sign labor contracts and restricting their ability to own property. Number 3, January 1866, which would also be a month later from December since when the last Black Code was passed, and also happens to be the first month of every year. Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida would enact their own Black Codes or laws, with similar provisions to Mississippi and South Carolina. Number 4, February 1866, the U.S. Congress would pass the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which was aimed at protecting the rights of freed slaves. Nah, that wasn't cool to most of them. President Andrew Johnson would, however, veto the bill. Number 5, March 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 would be passed, granting citizenship to freed slaves and protecting their civil rights. However, the act does not address labor restrictions or property ownership. So what's the use of a citizenship with labor restrictions and without property ownership? Let us move forward. Number 6, April 1866. The U.S. Army would begin to intervene in southern states to enforce the Civil Rights Act and protect freed slaves from black code and law provisions. This apparently was forcibly carried out by the U.S. soldiers in collective who, after seeing all the priceless work sacrificed by the people of color for the United States during the wars, couldn't perhaps just help sitting back to watch these shaming misfortunes unfold. Number 7, 1866 to 1867. Many southern states would revise or repeal their black laws and codes in response to federal pressure and the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Number 8, in 1868, the U.S. Congress would pass the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into military districts and requiring new state constitutions to be drafted. Number 9, 1870. The 15th Amendment is ratified, granting voting rights to African American men. Number 10, 1877. The Compromise of 1877 leads to the withdrawal of federal troops from southern states, allowing for the resurgence of white supremacist governments and the eventual disenfranchisement of African Americans. Some notable figures involved in the creation and enforcement of the black codes include: Number 1, Mississippi Governor Benjamin Humphreys. He signed the first black code into law in November 1865. Number 2, South Carolina Governor James Orr. This one enacted a comprehensive black code in December 1865. Number 3, Louisiana Governor James Madison Wells. This one had gone ahead to complement what has already been by implementing a black code that further restricted the rights and freedoms of black Americans who had just been freed from slavery. Since the colonial period, colonies and states had passed laws that discriminated against free blacks. In the South, these were generally included in slave codes. The goal was to suppress the influence of free blacks, particularly after slave rebellions, because of their potential influence on slaves. Free men of color were denied the vote in the North Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1835. Restrictions included bearing arms, gathering in groups for worship, and learning to read and write. The purpose of these laws was to preserve slavery in slave societies. Black codes, restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery, would be abolished during the Civil War. Although the Union's victory had given some 4 million enslaved people of color their freedom, the question of freed black people's status in the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states would require that people of color should sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. These black codes and laws, though varying from state to state, were all intended to secure a steady supply of cheap labor, and all continued to assume the racial and social inferiority of formerly enslaved people. There were vagrancy laws that declared a black person to be vagrant if unemployed and without permanent residence. A person so defined could be arrested, fined, and bound out for a term of labor if unable to pay the fine. Portions of a vagrancy law enacted by the state legislature of Mississippi in 1865 provides an example.
Section 2. Be it further enacted that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes in this state over the age of 18 years, found on the second Monday in January 1866, or thereafter, with no lawful employment or business, or found unlawfully assembling themselves together, either in the day or night time, and all white persons so assembling with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes, or usually associating with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes on terms of equality, or living in adultery or fornication with a freedwoman, free Negro, or mulatto shall be deemed vagrants, and, on conviction thereof, shall be fined in the sum of not exceeding, in the case of a freedman, free Negro, or mulatto, $150, and a white man, $200, and imprisoned at the discretion of the court, the free Negro not exceeding 10 days, and the white man not exceeding 6 months. Section 5. Be it further enacted that all fines and forfeitures collected under the provisions of this act shall be paid into the county treasury for general county purposes, and in case any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto shall fail for 5 days after the imposition of any fine or forfeiture upon him or her for violation of any of the provisions of this act to pay the same, that it shall be, and is hereby made, the duty of the sheriff of the proper county to hire out said freedman, free Negro, or mulatto to any person who will, for the shortest period of service, pay said fine or forfeiture and all costs.
Apprentice laws provided for the hiring out of black orphans and other young dependents to white people who sometimes had previously been their enslavers. Some states limited the type of property African Americans could own, and in other states, black people were excluded from certain businesses or from skilled trades. Formerly enslaved people were forbidden to carry firearms, and they were not allowed to testify in court, except in cases concerning other black people like they are. Legal marriage between African Americans was provided for, but interracial marriage was prohibited. Outrage over black codes would help undermine support for President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Party. When President Abraham Lincoln announced the impending passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863, the stakes of the Civil War shifted dramatically. A Union victory would mean no less than revolution in the South, where the peculiar institution of slavery had dominated economic, political, and social life in the antebellum years. In April 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln shocked many by proposing limited suffrage for African Americans in the South. He was assassinated days later, however, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, would be the one to preside over the beginning of Reconstruction. Johnson, a former senator from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union during the war, was a firm supporter of states' rights and believed the federal government had no say in issues such as voting requirements at the state level. Under his Reconstruction policies, which had begun in May 1865, the former Confederate states were required to uphold the abolition of slavery, made official by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, swear loyalty to the Union, and pay off their war debt. Beyond those limitations, the states and their ruling class, traditionally dominated by white planters, were given a relatively free hand in rebuilding their own governments. Even as formerly enslaved people fought to assert their independence and gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of Reconstruction, white landowners had acted to gain control over the labor force. This they did through a system similar to the one that had existed during the slave era. To this end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina had enacted the first black codes. Mississippi's law required black people to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced to forfeit earlier wages and were subject to arrest. In South Carolina, a law prohibited black people from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax of $10 to $100. This provision would hit the free people of color already living in Charleston, and former slave artisans especially, very hard. In both states, black people were given heavy penalties for vagrancy, including forced plantation labor in some cases. Under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, nearly all the southern states would enact their own black codes in 1865 and 1866. While the codes granted certain freedoms to African Americans, including the right to buy and own property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court, this was only valid when it came to cases involving only people of their own race. Their primary purpose was to restrict black people's labor and activity. Some states would go on to limit the type of property that black people could own, while virtually all the former Confederate states would pass strict vagrancy and labor contract laws, as well as so-called anti-enticement measures designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a black laborer already under contract. Here's an image of a free black man whose labor is being auctioned in Monticello, Florida in 1867. According to the black codes in Florida at that time, a black person who was unable to pay a fine or was found to have broken a contract could have their labor sold for a period of time. The result was, in effect, the enslavement of that person, and the manner in which they were sold, as depicted in this illustration, resembled auctions of enslaved people prior to the Civil War. Black people who broke labor contracts were subject to arrest, beating, and forced labor, and apprenticeship laws would force many minors, either orphans or those whose parents were deemed unable to support them by a judge, into unpaid labor for white planters. This was, in fact, slavery in a different coat, passed by a political system in which black people effectively had no voice. The black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia forces, often made up of Confederate veterans of the Civil War, across the South. Let us have a look at the impact of the so-called black codes. The restrictive nature of the codes and widespread black resistance to their enforcement enraged many in the North, who argued that the codes violated the fundamental principles of free labor ideology. After passing the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto, Republicans in Congress did effectively take control of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the Constitution to former enslaved people, and enact universal male suffrage before they could rejoin the Union. The 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, guaranteed that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. During this period of radical Reconstruction, between 1867 and 77, black men did win election to Southern state governments and even to the U.S. Congress. As indicated by the passage of the Black Codes, however, white Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensuring their supremacy and the survival of plantation agriculture in the post-war years. Support for Reconstruction policies would wane after the early 1870s, undermined by the violence of white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. And did you know that in the years following Reconstruction, the South did reestablish many of the provisions of the Black Codes in the form of what you know to be Jim Crow laws? It was Northern reaction to the Black Codes, as well as to the Memphis mass killing and the New Orleans mass killing, both of which were attacks by white mobs on black residents of those cities in 1866, that helped produce radical Reconstruction from 1867 to 1877, and the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The Freedmen's Bureau, created in 1865, was another effort by the federal government to help formerly enslaved people. Reconstruction did do away with the Black Codes, but after Reconstruction ended in 1877, many of their provisions would be reenacted by Southern states through Jim Crow laws. This could be likened to some undying plague, like some kind of metamorphosis of some plague, morphing from one form to the other, instead of being eradicated once and for all. Only this was not a plague born of some environmental pollution or bacteria. This was some plague born of the human mind, a mind filled up with indoctrination of racial hate, jealousy, wickedness, and all manner of ill will towards the other. By 1877, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, black Americans had seen little improvement in their economic and social status, and the vigorous efforts of white supremacist forces throughout the region had undone the political gains they had made. Discrimination would continue in America with the rise of Jim Crow laws. These would remain firmly in place for almost a century, but on the long run would inspire the civil rights movement to come, which, when it did, had abolished these backward, ill-bred, depraved laws by the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1963-1964. In closing, the Black Codes represent a painful chapter in American history, highlighting the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice. By uncovering this dark history of Black Codes or laws, enacted only for the sheer oppression, repression, derogation, and dehumanization of the people of color, we can better understand the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice for so long now in America. That brings us to the end of yet another thought-provoking video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Then reach out to the comment section on your opinions. We value all of them. Don't forget to hit the thumb button, share video with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in if you are yet to. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.